This video is about dialectical materialism, the communist philosophy. It's produced to help introduce communist philosophy to workers, students, soldiers, and sailors who want to know more about the fight for communism. Much of the material in this video is based on a series of articles on dialectical materialism that were first published in Red Flag, the newspaper of the International Communist Workers' Party, ICWP. A collection of those articles is available on the ICWP website, and more will be published.
It's obvious that creating communism will be a huge change in the world, a change that can only be brought about by a mass movement of billions of people who know what they're doing. To make this big change happen, the masses have to know quite a bit about what makes things change and how to understand and explain the changes that actually happen. Capitalists have quite a collection of philosophical ideas that stand in the way of the knowledge we need. Some claim that real change isn't possible at all. Others say that there's no truth that can be known. Others say that gods or religions control everything. And they have a lot of other false and harmful ideas. Dialectical materialism, the communist philosophy, gives us the ability to get a true or nearly true picture of how capitalism works, what it would take to eliminate it, and how to build up communism after capitalism is gone. Communists aim to let this communist philosophy escape from classrooms and textbooks and be presented and discussed so that everyone can understand it. We're trying to learn how to do this in various ways. This includes the Red Flag newspaper, not just the dialectics articles in the Red Flag, but many articles on politics or economics. We also have study groups, pamphlets, and we hope also this video will be helpful too.
Here are some of the topics that will be discussed in this video. How things are connected, whether they're close together or far apart. Differences and similarities between things. Unity, opposition, and conflict in the relationships between things. Dialectical contradictions and how they make things change. How dialectical contradictions are resolved. Materialism versus idealism, and the internal contradictions of the capitalist system and how they lead to communism.
One basic idea of dialectical materialism is that things, events, and people are connected with each other and influence each other even when they're separated in time and space. Sometimes these connections are obvious, and sometimes they are not. Some connections depend on what people think or believe, but many do not. We will look first at a few examples of connections in the natural world and then some social connections.
In 2011, a major earthquake hit the coast of Japan. The earthquake caused a tidal wave which killed many people and caused a meltdown of several Japanese nuclear electric plants. Industrial production was disrupted in Japan and many other places, including the United States and South Africa. The connection between the Japanese earthquake and the shutting down the auto plants around the world is a connection between a natural event and a series of social changes that resulted from it. There are also long-distance connections between events that are entirely natural. Here is an interesting example of a natural long-distance connection. Not all weather is local. The weather in one area of the Pacific Ocean off the west coast of South America has an important connection to weather in other places, far away. One of those faraway places is California, where the amount of snow that falls in the winter is partly determined by weather in the Pacific. If the weather off South America is warm and wet in December, January, and February, more snow is likely to fall in California. This connection is called the El Niño effect. El Niño means the baby Jesus. It was probably named that because El Niño happens near Christmas time, but there's nothing religious or even mental about the connection. It's a real relationship studied by weather scientists that existed before anybody knew about it. When El Niño happens, it changes the weather for a lot of the rest of the planet. It makes Southwest Africa warmer and drier than it would otherwise be, and it makes India and China warmer, as the colored areas on the map show.
Like the connection between the Japanese earthquake and factory shutdowns, the El Niño connection is objective. It happens whether people understand it or not, and whether they want it to happen or not. That there are important connections that don't depend on what people think is a part of materialism. The El Niño connection is a link between two parts of the Earth's weather system, which is a material system.
In South Africa in 2002, there were big strikes in the platinum mines in Marikana, strikes that were repressed by the boss's cops with mass murder of strikers. During the strikes, the mine owners used their knowledge of international material connections in the platinum market. Since South Africa exports platinum to the world, strikes at big mines would normally reduce the supply and make the price of platinum rise internationally. This did not happen very much during the strikes because the mine owners used their knowledge of how the international market works. They stockpiled platinum in advance and released it during the strike so that they could keep making profits. In the communist movement, we must use our knowledge of material connections to help us win.
For the fight for communism, however, the most important material connections are those among workers and between workers and bosses, connections that make up social class relationships. Ideas and thinking play a role in these connections, but there is an underlying objective reality to them that doesn't depend on what anyone thinks. It is a material reality of class structure.
In 2013, a building that contained many garment factories collapsed in Bangladesh. The building owners had overloaded the building with heavy machinery. Garment bosses refused to let workers leave when cracks in the walls began to appear. This completely preventable tragedy outraged workers all over the world. But the connection between Bangladeshi workers and workers in other countries is not just emotional. It is also something more than our just being victims of the same worldwide capitalist system. Our connection, our common interest as workers, makes it possible for us to make a deliberate organizational connection so that we can help create a united mass movement for communism. Right now, this movement is small, but the real material connections between workers makes it possible for it to grow and to include the majority of the people on the planet. These pictures show a protest in the garment district of Los Angeles, California, about the deaths of the Bangladeshi workers. They were killed by the greed of bosses in Bangladesh and the many other countries who do business there because of the extremely low wages that Bangladeshi workers are forced to work for. Capitalists set up a competition between workers in different places by moving work where the wages are lowest. But competition is not the main connection between workers in different countries. Our common interests as members of the working class makes it benefit each of us if we unite and fight for all of us. Creating this unity under capitalism is a hard struggle. Learning about and spreading the news about the suffering and the heroism of workers in other places helps us understand the situation of our class under capitalism and helps us see that communism is the only way out of capitalist oppression for all of us. Letting the masses know about the struggles of workers in other places helps people see that we are all members of one class and inspires us to imitate and follow those who are taking the initiative now. Knowing about what people are doing in other places not only points out the existing economic connection between workers in different places, but it helps create the political connection we need to unify workers' thinkings and actions so that we can work out a common political line based on real connections. Connections, when they exist, don't necessarily unify the things that are connected. People are connected to things they oppose, even to things they try to destroy. These demonstrators are confronting police in Germany, police who are protecting a bunch of anti-Muslim racists. The demonstrators' sign says, "Against all racism." These workers and their supporters are demanding higher wages from McDonald's, the giant fast food corporation. Trying to confront the corporation, they have also to confront the cops, the bosses' hired guns. This is a connection of opposites, the connection of the two sides in the class struggle.
So far we've talked a little bit about connections. We've found that things that are far apart in space or in time can have a significant effect on each other. We found out that connections can be the kind that unify and assist each other, or connections can be oppositions, conflicts, even attempts to destroy each other. We want to use some of this information about connections to apply to the situation of our movement. And in particular, I want to start with an example that I think many people are concerned about, which is there's a clear connection between our communist movement and the communist movements of the past, movements in Russia and China that fought for socialism. And we can see that those movements are historic failures. That is, the result has been obvious and open capitalism, even in the case of China, where they're reluctant to admit it. So here's the question we ask: how is it that our movement for communism would not end up in the same result? So in dialectical terminology, the question we're asking here is whether our movement is more similar than different to past movements that failed, or whether it is more different than similar. To start thinking about similarity and difference, let's look at similarities and differences between two kinds of balls that are used in games: soccer balls and golf balls. Admittedly, this example is not very serious, but there's still something to be learned by looking at it. We can start by looking at the difference in size and shape and weight and color and what they're made of. There are both similarities and differences here. This is about 9 inches. This is about 1.5 inches. Heavier. Air inside, nothing inside here, except solid. The bigger issue, though, in talking about the similarities and differences between these things is not just their physical characteristics, which is heavier, which is bigger, and such. It's about the similarities and differences in what these two things can be used for. In this case, and in general, we want to know what are the differences and similarities in the capabilities of things. Now, by capabilities, I mean what the things that we're discussing can do or what can be done with them by people. So how do we find out the differences and similarities in capabilities? Well, sometimes common sense is enough, and sometimes you need a correct theory. But the most basic way to find out about something's capabilities is practical experience. Now, even a little experience shows that there are really big differences, which are much more important than the similarities in these two kinds of balls.
If you actually try it out, you'll find it really doesn't work to play soccer with a golf ball. As it turns out, it's just as pointless to try to play golf with a soccer ball. The physical capabilities of the golf ball and the soccer ball are more different than similar. It follows that if you want to play soccer, don't bring a golf ball. But there's also a social side to their difference. Soccer is a game of the masses, played passionately by billions of people. Golf is expensive. Most people can't afford it. Many see it as a rich man's game and refuse to take an interest in it. So the physical differences between what the different balls can do have a connection to a fundamental social difference, the difference of social class. When we look at similarities and differences, the social characteristics will often be more important than the physical ones.
I admit that this whole business about the two balls is a kind of a joke, although it does show something about the similarities and differences. But let's look now about the similarities and differences in a more serious vein, that is, about the differences between men and women. Now, obviously, women can have babies and men can't, but the big question is how much do men and women differ in what they can do in their capabilities, the kind of capabilities that would show up in particular in work or in politics.
The boss's ideology of sexism portrays women as weak and incapable, or just as sex objects, and assigns them a secondary role in life, work, and politics. Objective evaluation of similarities and differences shows that men and women are much more similar in what they can do than they are different. This is especially true of working-class men and women. The forces that mold us into workers have similar effects on both sexes and give us similar capabilities. This includes the ability to understand our communist future and fight for it. Mobilizing the masses for communism includes women playing a leading role. Women can do everything, and they should. This includes armed struggle when the need arises. One of the biggest issues about similarities in the communist movement is the question of what makes people more similar than different and their abilities to make collective changes, and especially to fight against capitalism. Various kinds of so-called identity politics claim that something other than social class makes people more similar than different. Some say that people in the same race have more in common and a greater capacity to unite than workers of different races. Others make similar claims about religion, about nationality, about living in a former colony, and so on. All of these ideologies hold back the working class movement and allow the misery of capitalism to last just that much longer. This is especially true of the idea that racial differences are more important than class differences, and that having the same race or nation makes people more similar than being in the same class. Racism is one of capitalism's main tools to divide and conquer us. The working class can't advance when it's deeply divided, much less overthrow capitalism. Capitalists impose greater oppression, terror, and super-exploitation on workers of some racial or ethnic groups. They make us extra profit by doing this, and they reinforce their rule by creating and maintaining racial divisions. This is a political attack on the whole working class. Many people reject this capitalist attack, as we can see from the multiracial mass movements now taking place against racist police murder. For example, about Ferguson in the United States. The working class movement must not only overcome racial divisions, but they also need to recognize that capitalists and workers are far more different than they are similar, even if those capitalists and workers have the same race or nation. Herman Cain, the guy in the picture on the left, is the former chief executive of a fast food restaurant chain, former candidate for U.S. president, former head of a U.S. government bank, and head of a big association of U.S. restaurant owners. Not many people are going to believe that this guy is more similar than different to the workers struggling for a higher wage in the fast food restaurants, workers who are shown here on the right. But that is what it would mean to claim that race or nationality is a greater source of similar capabilities than social class is. When workers make alliances with capitalists, they always lose. They might as well try to play soccer with a golf ball. Creating a united working class depends on overcoming the racism constantly generated by capitalism. This is a life and death question for the working class, and the fight for communism depends on it. With communist leadership, it's a fight the workers can win.
When we started talking about sameness and difference, I raised the question of how our communist movement is different from the old movement. The basic difference is that the old movement was fighting for socialism, and our movement is fighting for communism directly. Socialism is more similar than different to frank and open capitalism.
Unlike communism, which distributes goods and services to people based on need, socialism has a wage system. Wage systems always mean inequality and always maintain racial, gender, and regional inequalities in wages. From the early days of the Soviet Union, the income of the top officials was many times the income of workers, and there was also a lot of inequality among workers. The situation has been similar in China since the 1950s, but recently the top Chinese party leaders have stolen enormous incomes. Many are richer than big American capitalists. Socialism not only produces large inequalities in income, it also quickly grows a hierarchy of power and privilege that becomes a new capitalist class. This situation is not just the result of betrayal of the workers by leaders, although that does happen. Socialism is subject to the laws of motion of capitalism, and they determine how it evolves.
Under socialism, eventually the mask comes off and full-blown capitalism is standing there. Fighting for socialism is fighting for a form of capitalism. And the results are always the same and would be the same if there were another socialist revolution. That is, eventual open capitalism again. Mobilizing the masses of the whole globe for communism is a fundamentally different movement from socialism, one that will finally win. To get there, however, billions of people have to learn about dialectics and about communist politics.
Dialectics is basically about change, about how to explain change and how to make things change. We've already discussed a little about connections and about similarity and difference, but not much about change. That is, about dialectics, properly speaking. So it's time that we looked at some of the concepts that are useful for describing change. One basic kind of change is the increase or decrease of something that could be measured in numbers. This could be the temperature outside, the score in a game, the size of a political movement, the amount of money in your cookie jar, and of course many others. Changes in these things are called quantitative changes. If a quantitative change is small, and sometimes even if it's big, the thing that changes still acts or has the capability to act in roughly the same way. If the temperature goes down outside or up by a few degrees, I can still work, relax, play sports, etc. There's another kind of change that usually can't be measured in numbers, but means changing from one kind of activity or capability to a significantly different kind. To give an example of this second kind of change, let's cook breakfast. I eat oatmeal almost every day. I like it, and the doctor says it's good for you. As it comes out of the bag, however, you can't eat it. Yuck. Tastes like cardboard. But if I put it in boiling water and I let it cook for about 5 minutes, it isn't cardboard anymore, and it's soft and smooth. This means that the cooking brings about a change in the quality of the oatmeal, a qualitative change brought about by the application of heat and stirring and sometimes some other things like adding a little salt. This change of quality involves a change in the way something behaves, or in its capabilities to do something, or in its ability to be used by people for something. It does this because the internal organization of the thing that changes is modified. Of course, this is the main purpose of cooking, generally speaking, which is to make something that's inedible into something that's edible and maybe pretty good. Here is another example from the kitchen. Ice. As everybody knows, ice is frozen water. It's hard and it keeps its shape. In other words, it's a solid. You could even make a weapon out of ice, but if you let it warm up in the sun for a few minutes, you'll just have a wet spot on the ground, not a solid. This is a typical qualitative change. The capabilities of ice change dramatically when it warms up. Warming up, however, means that the temperature changes, and temperature is a quantity. So, quantity change can bring about qualitative change. The difference between change in quantity and change in quality is important for revolutionary politics. Our movement is on the road to make a qualitative change in society from capitalism to communism. To make this change, the masses need to understand that such a big qualitative change is possible, that there can be a fundamental change in the way the whole society operates. Many people don't agree that it's possible to change society from exploitation and inequality into one where everyone works as they are able and shares the results according to everybody's needs. The alternative they propose is just a change in quantity, usually an increase in income or a decrease in the expenses for people who don't have much. Sometimes these reform movements involve masses of people, like the demonstrations against the increase in bus fares in Brazil or the fight for a higher minimum wage in the United States. Communists take part in these kind of movements to reach people with the idea that the real problem is the whole capitalist system and that we really need a qualitative change into communism, not just an increase or a decrease of something. Qualitative changes are leaps to a new situation, and they usually happen fast, even if a long period of development is necessary in order to make them happen. A war, an economic crisis, an earthquake, or a revolution is often a quick change in quality, even when its effects take a long time to produce and last a long time afterwards. Changes in quantity are usually slower and more gradual than changes in quality. There's a fundamental connection between quantitative and qualitative change, however, and this connection represents one of the laws of dialectics. An increase or a decrease in quantity, continued far enough, results in a qualitative change. This is the law of quantity changing into quality. If you reduce a person's food far enough, he or she will die. If you increase a family's debts far enough, they'll eventually go bankrupt. If the tension inside the earth gets high enough, an earthquake happens. And of course, this is true in politics as well. Longer or more intense wars or economic crises can help convince workers that they can't continue to live in the old way and create new conditions where the rapid growth of the communist movement is possible. Even without a big crisis, extended political work that you carry on consistently for a long time, can produce qualitative changes. For example, if you increase the number of red flag readers in a factory from 2% to 20%, the political situation in the factory will probably make a qualitative leap. It's important to realize, however, that there might be more than one qualitative change that becomes possible when quantities add up sufficiently. The result of long-term increases in unemployment or many deaths in imperialist war might be that workers become more revolutionary, or they might become more religious or anti-foreigner. Good developments in the consciousness and in the activity of the working class depend on what we do, not just on what the capitalists do to us. Qualitative change is inevitable, but we have to fight for the best kind of qualitative change, the qualitative change from capitalism to communism. The dialectics of contradiction is the heart of communist philosophy and the explanation of how revolutionary change happens. Dialectical thinking has been around for a long time. Our sources for dialectics go back for many centuries. Heraclitus, an ancient Greek philosopher, expressed the most important idea in dialectics this way. He said, "Conflict is the father of everything." Of course, he should have said that it's the father and mother of everything. He meant conflict makes things change, and conflict is the only way things change. Everything new comes out of conflict. Building on earlier dialectical philosophy, Marx and Engels developed dialectics about 150 years ago. The communist movement in the USSR and China added to dialectics, but not all of what they added is correct. Leaders of the old socialist movements like Lenin and Mao Zedong studied dialectics and fought to teach the working class to understand and apply it. Later in this video, we will see some ways that dialectics is needed to understand how the capitalist system works, what its fatal weaknesses are, and how to defeat it. We already know that many things and processes are connected, And then in some of those connections, the things connected oppose each other. A concept of dialectics that we need to understand then is opposition, the relation of connected opposites. The relation between a parent and a child is an example of opposition. This may seem a little strange since many people get along well with their parents and their children and are not in conflict with them. As the term opposite is used in dialectics, however, the parents and their children still count as opposites. Within each parent-child relationship, one side is the parent and not the child, and the other side is the child and not the parent. So the two sides exclude each other. It is also true that parents have a big effect on their children and children have a big effect on their parents. Thus, the parent-child relationship has both exclusion and dependence, and so we have an example of opposition. In general, we can define opposites this way. Opposites have a connection with each other so that each side requires or depends on the other or is affected by the other. Opposites also exclude each other, and each side has some property that the other does not have. Here are some examples of opposites. Notice that the last example, workers versus capitalists, differs from the others. Buying and selling, or theory and practice, can help each other out. But the relationship between capitalists and workers is always exploitation and resistance. They don't help each other out. In the rare cases when capitalists do something that workers actually want, it's only a tactic to keep exploiting them. Workers and capitalists interfere with or block each other. This is the kind of opposition that we need to focus on. An essential idea of dialectics is that some opposites struggle or interfere with each other. This kind of opposition is called a dialectical contradiction. Every opposite relation has to have some kind of unity or mutual dependence. But opposites that struggle, whose opposite sides hold each other back and interfere with each other, are called dialectical contradictions. This means that a dialectical contradiction is a unity and struggle of opposites. To learn about dialectical contradictions, we will look at a number of examples. In capitalist society, the most important dialectical contradiction is the one between the working class and the capitalist class. This contradiction shows itself in many ways, including strikes and demonstrations. For capitalists and workers to be opposites, each side must affect or depend on the other. This opposition is a contradiction, so capitalists and workers conflict and interfere with each other. Capitalists need workers to make profits for them, but they struggle to keep workers from revolting. As long as capitalism exists, workers need to get jobs from capitalists, although capitalism often produces mass unemployment. Under capitalism, capitalists need workers and workers need capitalists, but they constantly battle each other. Class struggle is not the only place to find dialectical contradictions. The unity and struggle of opposites is everywhere. A soccer match is a contradiction between two sides. The two sides are united in a single game, with each side fighting to score goals. Both teams often play defense, however, trying to hold the other side back and interfering with their attempts to score. There is one important difference between a soccer contradiction and class struggle, however. When the referee blows the final whistle, the contradiction ends and the team may go out for a beer together. Class struggle does not have a referee. It continues until the capitalist class is destroyed. Capitalist countries sit in a network of relations that have both unity and struggle. These countries trade with each other and make political, economic, and military alliances. This is a kind of unity. Despite some degree of unity, capitalists compete for control of resources and labor. The governments of each country struggles to make maximum profits for their capitalists, holding back the others with tariffs, diplomacy, powerful organizations like the International Monetary Fund, and eventually by war. The contradictions between the biggest capitalist powers, the imperialists, dominate the politics, economics, and ideology of the whole planet. Contradictions don't just happen in society. There are also contradictions everywhere in nature. In the center of an atom, for example, there's a contradiction between the forces that hold it together and other forces that tend to drive it apart. If the forces holding the atom together are stronger, then the atom will be stable, at least for the time being. If the forces that drive the atom's particles apart become stronger than those that hold it together, then the atom comes apart. If this happens to many atoms at the same time, the result is a huge explosion. In the working class movement, there are extremely important contradictions between the revolution and the kind of politics that try to compromise with capitalism. Revisionism is the name for politics that claims to be Marxist, but in fact submits to capitalism. Led by Lenin, the Russian Bolsheviks fought a long, determined struggle against many forms of reformist or revisionist politics, like those of the Russian Mensheviks and the German Social Democrats. It was only because of that struggle that the Bolshevik Revolution was able to win in 1917. It was also the failure to defeat pro-capitalist ideas like socialism that eventually defeated the communist movement in Russia and China. The struggle between revolution and revisionism always takes place inside revolutionary parties, including ICWP. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in China, which began in 1965, was the world's first example of a mass struggle against revisionist politics, a struggle that lost out and the communist movement was defeated in China. Contradictions are important because they make things change. As Heraclitus said, conflict is the father and mother of everything. The main reason why dialectics is important is that understanding contradictions makes it possible to understand how reality must change and how to make the changes we need. The internal back and forth struggle of the two sides of a contradiction not only cause change, but points that change in a particular direction. The way the change happens can be smooth and gradual for a while, but contradictions also produce big sudden changes, revolutions, wars, explosions, and economic crises. As long as capitalism lasts, its internal contradictions push capitalist society toward crisis and revolution. The contradictions of the U.S. financial system produced a huge crisis in 2007. That crisis spread to Europe and eventually affected most of the world. This crisis made class struggle in Greece much more intense. Contradictions inside the center of an atom can make it break up into smaller atoms. Once an atom is split into two, the contradictions that made it split are over and done with, and new contradictions begin inside the new atoms. Once a contradiction ends, we say that it is resolved. A key issue about contradictions is how they get to be resolved. That is, stop being contradictions. It's also important to ask what is left over after a contradiction is resolved. Contradictions in society and nature are resolved by their conflict becoming more intense, that is, by the struggle of the two sides becoming stronger. Eventually, one side defeats the other. Compromises and truces don't resolve these contradictions, they just make the resolution take longer. If the defeated side is destroyed, the contradiction is resolved. If one side only achieves a stronger position, the contradiction still exists and the weaker side might be able to strike back. That is why a communist revolution must wipe out capitalism everywhere and not allow capitalist relationships to continue as they do under socialism. Like contradictions in society and in nature, contradictions between ideas are usually resolved by becoming more intense and one side being defeated. In this case, however, it is the ideas that get defeated and not necessarily the people who agree or used to agree with those ideas. Scientific researchers who discover a new theory try to win over those who agree with the old view. The new idea wins if most researchers eventually accept it. The same is true for disagreements inside the party. The contradiction between opposite ideas is resolved when the internal debate persuades most people that one view is right. Sometimes it happens that the best thinking combines some parts of each side's ideas. This happens when each side had some truth in it, but was one-sided, which means that it did not include the whole story. Since contradictions are everywhere, contradictions inside the party are normal and unavoidable, and the struggle to resolve them helps keep the party's ideas moving forward. This struggle includes debate among different points of view and can take time, since more practical experience may be necessary to come to a conclusion that most can accept. It's tempting to try to avoid disagreements with comrades, but this attitude does not help resolve contradictions that inevitably come up. Contradictions are resolved by becoming more intense, not by being swept under the rug. Contradictions in physical processes also produce movement. When a gun fires, the hot gases in the chamber and the metal walls of the chamber push on each other and form a very intense contradiction. The contradiction between the pressure of the hot gas on the metal walls and the pressure of the walls on the hot gas can only be resolved when the gas escapes. But the gas can only escape when the bullet moves out of the barrel, fast. When the gas escapes, the contradiction is over, since both the gas pressure and the force from the metal walls have ended. Resolution of the capitalist worker contradiction is not like a shot from a pistol. The resolution does not happen quickly, since it takes a long time for the working class to build up its Communist Party and make the contradictions intense enough to resolve it. The capitalist also needs to get weaker for the workers to win. We know this will happen since it's part of the nature of capitalism to produce economic crises and tremendously destructive imperialist wars, which seriously weaken the capitalists, at least for a while. The laws of motion of capitalism, like the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, will create capitalist crises and give us our opportunities. Right now, the masses are mobilized for reforms in many places. As the party mobilizes the masses for communism, that movement will create more intense crises for capitalism and resolve the worker-capitalist contradiction by communist revolution. Communists understand that true ideas, including true theories, have power. This is not the idealist view that ideas change the world all by themselves. It means that what people believe and understand motivates what they do. Marx wrote that material force must be overthrown by material force, but theory also becomes a material force as soon as it is gripped by the masses. The main thing that drives the communist movement forward, however, is the contradiction between the needs of the masses and the poverty, murder, racism, repression, diseases, imperialist wars, economic crises, and all the other miseries that capitalism imposes on us. This video tries to show some of the ways that dialectics helps us understand the many-sided contradiction of capitalism with the needs of the masses. Dialectics is a vital tool for mobilizing the masses to win the fight for communism.